Alright, this is part 2 in my little vlog here about repairing my car. My radiator just came in today. There's the pre-existing fan, and then I've got my socket set, and then those are the pieces that came off of the radiator and that metal piece I showed you on the front. And there, of course, is the harness so that you can reattach that to the fan, and that gets plugged back into the wiring harness in the car. Now these are for the compressor back to the radiator, and those are for the fan itself. It requires 4 bolts, and these are 13 millimeters. These are for that metal piece that I showed you that goes across the top of the radiator and condenser. These are 10 millimeter, and those are 10 millimeter as well. This I did not mention in the last video, but that's kind of important. This is for your negative battery cable. You need to make sure you unhook it from the car and make sure it's somewhere where it will not ground back out before you start working on your alternator, because if you do, if you forget to take this off, you could potentially damage yourself or the car. Now, as far as step 1, before we start any kind of repair, you want to look over your radiator. This is kind of a no-brainer, but you want to look over your radiator, any parts you buy, and make sure you do not see any physical damage that could potentially stop you from installing this in your vehicle. Now, I did mention there is supposed to be rubber O-ring like isolations up here. These did not come with the radiator, unfortunately, so I'll have to make a trip to AutoZone and see about picking those up. There is, let's see, make sure this is actually the correct one. Okay, there's the hooks on the front where it hooks onto the condenser, and then you've got your upper hose, there's your lower hose, there's the drain cock I mentioned before, and that is tightened all the way down, as you can see. You want to make sure that's tight so that when you start refilling up the radiator, it does not start leaking out the bottom, obviously. Alright. These rubber grommets on the bottom are removable, and since they come with the radiator, I am not going to reuse the ones from the old one, which I was thinking I was going to have to do. Make sure you don't see any kind of bent fin or any kind of blemish that could potentially prevent the radiator from working correctly, which thankfully the back looks good. And as far as I can tell on the front looks good as well. I'm hoping this is not an issue, but it looks like there's a minor design difference between the old radiator and the new one. This one actually has a support bracket across the top, which I'm assuming just means the actual internal diameter of the fan is smaller, and it's still going to take up the same amount of physical space. Okay, so as you can tell, the radiator fan is only going to go on one direction. Obviously, it should not be hanging about 6 to 8 inches, well, that's probably about 4 inches, off the bottom of the radiator. So when you go to put this on, be very careful with it. You'll line that up, just like that. And when you move this, physically pick it off the radiator and move it. Don't slide it, because you will damage the fins, which I think is what happened last time. And there you go. That's perfectly lined up right there. I have to install the bolts, which are 10 millimeter. Alright, so I got 1 bolt in there, and I was actually missing 2 bolts. I forgot about that. When I took this out, somebody did not have all 4 bolts into the bracket or into the radiator fan. So I'm going to hand thread 1 in each corner. The person who installed this last time, I'm assuming they put a new fan in at some point, or a new radiator, which you can't really tell by looking at the old radiator. They dropped a couple bolts somewhere, so instead of installing 1 on top, 1 on bottom to kind of give it a cross support, they were 1 on top, or 1 on each top corner, and I'm sure that probably jostled around and was causing damage. So I gotta get this tightened down. Now these bolts, if you have the ability to do so and it works out better for you, they actually have a Torx head in there, which is I believe it was a 25 or 30 is what I used to get those out of there initially. So there's that. Now this wiring harness I mentioned earlier, this little sucker right here, this is those red connectors go back to the fan, and then there's actually a harness right here inside the car where that harness plugs into that harness. So I'm going to go ahead and attach this back to the fans first. And this is a typical Dodge, from what I've seen, Dodge Chrysler. You just slide it in, lock it in place, and then same thing on the other side. Okay, that's lined up. Make sure it snaps in place. Okay, and when you go to put that back into the car, you've got to attach that harness, like I said, back to this other harness. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, when you go to remove the radiator, you have to slide up the condenser. This would probably be better as a two-man job, but you slide up the condenser, get it out of those tabs, and that just, oh, that's sitting in there a little funny. Okay, oh, there we go. This is, each corner of the radiator, top corner, has those tabs there. Just pull it straight up, down, and then same thing on the other side. It's up and over. And like I said, I've already got this completely disconnected. So all I gotta do now is pull this straight up and out. And it looks like, there we go. Now, there's the old radiator. You can tell that's pretty badly damaged. It's either the original or whoever put this in. My guess is it got all messed up while they were in the installation process, and it just got worse over time. This gash right here was actually what helped me figure out that I had a issue with my radiator. It was starting to go. My radiator hoses blew on me while I was driving down the road. Finally got the hoses replaced, locked the drain cock back down like I was supposed to, and start having liquid pour back out the front of my radiator, back down the frame along the condenser. After I got this out of there, tried filling it up with water just to see, and you could see liquid just pouring straight out of those two gashes right there. Now, this right here, like I said, is my fault. That's, I slipped and I hit it with my hand. That is that. Similar damage on that side. Top end. And I'm guessing based on this and this over here, that whoever put the fan in didn't know what they were doing, and they were dragging it along the radiator, like I stated earlier, is a bad idea. So I'm guessing that didn't help the situation any. Before I put the radiator in, I want to show you this. That hole down there on the bottom and that hole over there on the bottom are where the feet of your radiator, these right here, are going to fit into. Now you got to make sure you line them up, get them in there, or else, again, you could potentially damage your radiator, your condenser. I'm guessing at some point soon I'm probably going to need a new condenser because mine is pretty banged up. But I was still getting pretty good air conditioning, so we'll see what happens with that. So that took me probably all of 30 seconds, maybe a minute, to get the new radiator put in place. As you can see, it's a pretty good fit. I haven't screwed the condenser back into the radiator yet. there's your tabs. You can see how the feet down there are properly placed. So they're going to be nice and balanced in there. There's going to be a screw hole down there that I have to take care of. There's a screw hole on the other side. And then I've got to attach those brackets back to the top of the metal piece, which I would call it the radiator guard. I guess is the best name for it. And I know there's probably a proper term, but as I said, I'm not a mechanic. Got to reattach those to the radiator guard and get that all mounted back in place. And here is, so there's my fan hookup. As I stated earlier, that goes with this wiring harness, which is right, where'd it go to? Oh, crap. Okay, so good rule, make sure you get your wires out of the way before you start installing things. This one got stuck underneath my radiator, and I actually had to pull the radiator back up to get to it. But you see these two notches right here. There's actually a connection point on the back of the fan right there that just locks right back in like that. So that keeps your wires out of the way. And then move this. I'll just set that off to the front. And then I can start the process of putting in back in the airbox. And I'll hold off on installing radiator hoses until I get the alternator put in, which I'm hoping will be done next week. And yeah, should be good to go. I'm not going to put the overflow box in back just yet, because it's going to leave me the ability to get easier access to that pulley right there I mentioned earlier. That way I don't have to climb back under the car to do this. I can do everything from the top side. Obviously I have not put my tire back on yet, but I'll get to that. And brand new oil filter too. I'll have to do that in another video, but I literally did an oil change the same day I tried to do a radiator flush after putting the new hoses in, and then found out that I had a hole in my radiator. So new oil, at least it's a good thing. It's been sitting and hasn't been used, which means I still got my 3,000 miles on it. So when all this happened, originally I had to replace the thermostat housing. The thermostat, which is actually obviously underneath the housing, you pop that up and there's a thermostat ball in there. Had to put a new top hose, new bottom hose, and flushed it probably 3 times, and the overflow tank would not properly flush, and it kept pouring coolant back out the front of the car. On top of that, when I finally did kind of get it working, that's how I figured out the alternator wasn't working, was it started acting up about a week before the hoses blew, and I'd be driving down the road. I'd put a brand new battery in because I thought the battery was bad, and I started getting my battery light flashing on me. So I had a buddy of mine test it and find out, like I said before, that it was running low on its voltage. But all in all, the alternator is a lot easier to put in than the radiator to an extent, because once you get those 3 bolts and you loosen that pulley, then the radiator just, well, the alternator, excuse me, just drops back in place. You bolt it down and tighten that belt back on, and then you've got to do that connection there, and then there's a sensor connector right below it, which is that needs to be plugged in, and this needs to be plugged in, which that's the protective cap, and then it's just a horseshoe electrical connector underneath it. So you got to keep that covered and make sure you don't possibly damage your car. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get the airbox put back in, since I have no other need for anything on that side of the car. It's a pretty basic process. I did it backwards. I went ahead and took this air hose back off and went and installed the airbox. Forgot that the hose was so short that it actually was not allowing me to install the air filter with that attached. So I had to take the hose back off, They've actually had to disconnect this cable right here. And then part of the hose connection is that sensor right there is actually plugged into a hole right there at the top of the hose. This should be the mass airflow sensor if I'm not mistaken. So I've got that back on. You see it's one bolt, and then you can see that clip on the back has the harness back in place. So I've got to put the air filter back onto that and reattach it to that after it's been inserted into that. So there's the reassembled Airbox. You've got air filter inside there. There's actually a clip here and a clip on the other side that this hose will only reattach to this body one way. So you gotta line it in, and it's kind of a tight fit, but once you push it in there, it clicks in place. You've got your hose assembly right here that connects back into the airflow, or sorry, into your air hose. This cord right here, this cable right here, gets plugged back into your ignition coil, and then this just needs to be tightened back down. Which is a pretty simple process there. And then lastly, this is dropped. There's your mass airflow sensor. You just plug it right in there where the arrow is. Give it a good hard push, and then push it on that red tab to lock it in place. So that part's reassembled. And the rest of it's going to wait until I get the alternator.